people say, oh, it's, it's war, you shouldn't be preserving it. Well, come on. How do the modern generation realise that war's a bad thing unless they can see? If they can see that this gun can destroy a ship out there that's got 1,000 people, they don't understand war. It's not something parents, schools, etc. teach the modern generation. I lived here when I was a kid. Well, I didn't live here. I lived in the houses in Manawar Bay because there were two camps. There was a camp at Manawar Bay and there was a camp up here. My father was one of the last soldiers stationed here in the 50s. One of my uncles helped to build gun number 1. He was a blacksmith.
How many people would have been involved?
Most of the time there was just a few less than 200 people involved in the building of it. When they closed the place down, and they just left a couple of caretakers and all the army personnel went away, we went to live in Waiheke.
Would you agree, Sue, that the restoration of the tunnels has been an exercise in community cooperation?
Community cooperation when we started was all those people who'd been denied access to the site for years by the surrounding landowner. And of course it made it precious because they'd never been able to come because they'd been locked out, even though it was theirs and it was their land. It's also been community insofar as it's the army community, the few men who left. Because they appreciate just how important it was. So as we've found them, they've been happy to come and have a look and to sort of come and out maybe once or twice a year and talk to visitors. It's probably the only fort in the world that's being rebuilt by one of the men who built it in the first place.
So when were these tunnels constructed?
Between sort of 1942 and the first gun was finished the last week in November of 1945.
Getting late in the whole scheme of things, wasn't it? Who was responsible for the actual construction of the tunnels?
Well, they were designed by a lieutenant colonel in our army, and because the British engineering firms wouldn't build them, the government had to employ a workforce of their own. And so they decided to use the Public Works Department to build the tunnels. And so they had to find people with the right skills. But you couldn't use coal miners because the coal was needed for trains, ships, etc. So they collected up all the gold miners that they could find. Once half the tunnelling was done, army personnel started moving in because it was the army personnel who put all the hooks in the wall for the power cables and for the water pipes and fitted out the tunnels.
I'd like to present you with this, Sue. I found it in one of the local antique stores, and it's a little medical bowl that was used by the American military, and I thought it would be useful to put into the museum there at Stony.
It's a great idea because although they didn't actually help build the place, they weren't responsible for all the money at the end. The Americans were involved on Motutapu and Rangitoto building the causeway between the two islands, etc. And when the government wanted to give up on Stony Battery, the Americans demanded that it be finished. Our government pleaded poverty, when don't they? So eventually the Americans funded some of it.
Bunnies.
Yeah, rabbits. Little buggers.
So the emplacement's down over this fence?
Yeah.
Oh,
But
right.
there's 12 air vents.
Yeah.
Okay?
Right.
Because the lieutenant colonel who designed it's an amazing fella, and he's got it so that it doesn't matter which quarter the wind comes from, you've got air coming in, and so there's always a breeze. This is gun pit 2. Over there you've got Rangitoto, and then we've got Rakino. Now, if you take the middle of the gap between Rakino and Motutapu, make a nice isosceles triangle, and its bottom is the East Coast base. A cruiser or a battleship parked there can destroy the city, the railway, the wharves, the naval base, and most importantly the dry dock in about an hour and a half. But if they put somebody on Rangitoto, they can do it in half an hour. The job of this fort was to prevent a cruiser or a battleship getting to that piece of harbour or gulf. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible for people to envisage just how huge these guns were. The majority of the people didn't actually know the whole thing. There were 5 groups of people, and none of the 5 knew more than their little piece. You had to be a captain or higher to know what was the overall picture.
How long are the tunnels?
Just a few metres more or less than a kilometre of tunnel. Along that kilometre of tunnels there's about 26 different rooms, as well as the 3 gun pits. Basically, this is the first place in New Zealand they pumped concrete. They made concrete pumps. The original ones were modelled along the lines of a cruiser or a battleship bilge pump. You think of a kilometre of tunnel, and at the base, the wall is about that thick all the way along. At this height in the tunnel, the wall is this thick, okay? And up at the top, it's about there. So you've got a kilometre of tunnel with walls that thickness. This concrete here, that's more than 7 foot of solid concrete, because it protects the machinery which turns the gun. Right? Those bolts go down about 12 foot, okay? So there's concrete by the mile. Then the rooms amount to 11 big houses, okay? Now, that's an engineering feat, especially building it when they built it, and doing it by hand. There weren't any concrete trucks that trundled along the road. There was no road.
Sue, what happened to the guns?
Beginning in the 60s, the government decided they were going to make a fortune by taking the guns and the engines and everything out and selling them for scrap. They chopped them up into little pieces and gave them to the Japanese to build cars. The locals wrote to the government and they wanted the guns kept. Everybody who turns up here now says it was the government who was stupid, not the locals. There are people in the government and in all sorts of places who tell you that the plotting room at Stony Batter was never installed. And that was the very technical machinery which turned the guns and brought in the information from radar stations, etc. But in the 1950s, my father, plus a man who lived in Oneiroa later, were at the end of their time here, actually coating all that equipment, which they say was never here, in Vaseline,
Right.
wrapping it in brown paper, and putting it into crates, and it went to North Head, and I'd love to know where it went to. Seeing as how the powers that be won't agree that it was even here in the first place, I'm not likely to find what they did with it afterwards, am I? But see, secrecy. It's a historic reserve, okay? So in theory, the Department of Conservation mans it, looks after it, and all that. Whereas in fact, the Department of Conservation does nothing. It's mostly they don't care because they can't, because they're not given the money to do it. So a little group of, a dozen or so people on Waiheke are trying to restore it and rebuild it in the hope of at least having enough so that people can understand it. These people who come here, they come and they say, oh, 1 bomb and it would have been destroyed. And I say to them, excuse me, where was the plane coming from? And they don't understand because they've been brought up going to London in a day or a day and a half. They do not realise that we're the back of beyond, always have been, and it wasn't till the comet that you could fly to New Zealand. It is war. But the most important thing about this place is it's one of the engineering feats of the country. This is the first place they pumped concrete. And even the Institute of Engineers will tell you it's one of the engineering feats of the country to build it because of where it was built, the logistical problems of building, etc. So don't we honour our engineers and the guys who actually made this concrete?